Welcome back. Today we will talk about the first developments within early Japanese horror cinema. In this video we will not only cover the beginnings of Japanese horror cinema, but we'll also top it off with a closer look at two critically acclaimed movies from the 1950s. So let's dive right in. The first Japanese film studios were founded towards the end of the Meiji period, and if you search for any kind of horror movies from around this time, you will find that most were actually film adaptations of already popular kaidan stories, especially of those famous stories from the Edo period that we talked about when we discussed Japanese literature. There were, for instance, adaptations of tales such as Tokaido Yotsuya Kaidan, the ghost story of Yotsuya and Tokaido, Butandoro, the Peony Lantern story, or various versions of the Sarayasuki plot, which has been mentioned in previous videos too and is based on a kaidan usually called Bancho Sarayasuki. The title can be translated as The Manner of the Plates at Bancho. It's the story with the servant Okiku who gets thrown into a well. Besides these, you could also find movies about ghost cats and foxes. These must have been based on the old concepts of supernatural shape-shifting monster cats, often called kaibyo or bakeneko, and of shape-shifting foxes with paranormal abilities, often called kitsune, which is also the normal word for fox though, so if you ever hear the word kitsune, be aware that doesn't mean the person is necessarily talking about supernatural foxes. Both of these creatures date back a long time and are usually regarded as a type of yokai. A few concrete examples of the very first releases of such kaidan film adaptations are Oiwa Inari from 1910, which was probably also the very first Yotsuya kaidan film adaptation ever and was created by Studio Yokota Shokai. Butandoro from 1910, which must have been based on the Peony Lantern kaidan and was created by Studio Yoshizawa Shoten. As a side note, both Studio Yokota Shokai and Yoshizawa Shoten would merge with some others into Studio Nikkatsu in 1912, which is Japan's oldest major film studio and still exists today, although it did also have some periods of inactivity and even declared bankruptcy in 1993, but was eventually bought up in 2005 and revived in 2010. Then there was Shinbutandoro from 1910, which basically translates to the New Peony Lantern, also from Studio Yoshizawa Shoten. Another Tokaido Yotsuya Kaidan film adaptation simply called Yotsuya Kaidan from 1911, again by Studio Yoshizawa Shoten, or Bancho Sarayasuki from 1911, which must have been again based on the Manner of the Plates kaidan and was created by Studio Yokota Shokai, and many more. And these kinds of movies must have been fairly successful because soon it became an actual custom to release kaidan movies every summer. By the way, this particular choice of summer as the season for annual kaidan movies might have been influenced by the general connection between summer and ghost stories which exists in Japan. Similar to how some Western countries nowadays associate autumn with scary stories, October in particular, due to Halloween, there is a comparable relationship between summer and everything eerie in Japan, which actually goes back a long way. Even the Hyakumonogatari Kaidan Kai from the Edo period, those gatherings where 100 candles were lit and 100 kaidan were told, were usually done on hot summer nights, and it was also during summer that a lot of the horror-related theater plays, such as Yotsuya Kaidan, were usually performed. As for the reason behind this, some say it's because of the Obon festival, a Buddhist festival during which the dead are believed to return for a few days, which is a decades-old custom in Japan that takes place in summer. And if we think about how Halloween has caused many to associate autumn with horror, it does make sense that an annual summer festival that deals with the return of the spirits of the dead could cause folks in Japan to associate summertime with ghosts. Others claim, by the way, that frightening tales are so popular during summer because the fear that you experience through ghost stories will make you shiver so much that it helps you cool down in the fierce summer heat. I'm not sure how well that really works, but I'm not making this up. That's a claim you can find. Be that as it may, these kaidan film adaptations must have struck a chord, for I doubt the release of kaidan movies would have otherwise turned into an annual summer custom if it had just been a one-time fad. Now, two noteworthy figures who rode the momentum of this trend are a certain director Makino Shozo and actor Onoe Matsunosuke. Both created a staple of kaidan movies that helped the whole genre become even more popular from 1914 onwards. Originally, Onoe Matsunosuke had played hero characters in ninja movies. After that, he became even more popular as an actor in samurai films, but director Makino Shozo began to realize that the particular special effects that had been employed in ninja and samurai films would also work amazingly well for the depiction of supernatural phenomena. That is not to say, though, that they never did any other genre again after that. In fact, Makino Shozo is well known for a lot more, but that's outside the scope of the series. The world of Japanese horror cinema in the 1920s and 1930s continued the kaidan movie trend and saw even more film adaptations of classical kaidan tales. In a way, one could say that the Edo period kaidan craze that had taken place within Japanese literature, theater, etc. had found a sort of continuation in the new medium of moving pictures by means of repeated kaidan film adaptations, led by ever-new versions of the three particularly famous works Yotsuya Kaidan, Sarayasuki, and Botandoro. Then, at the start of the 1940s, during the Second World War, many film studios were merged and put under state control. But when the war ended in 1945, the number of studios rose again. For example, staff members of a studio called Toho left the company and founded the studio Shin Toho in 1947, which basically translates to New Toho, by the way. Furthermore, 1951 saw the creation of Studio Toei, and in 1954, the studio Nikkatsu, which had eventually stopped producing films during World War II, was reopened. And so, eventually, the six biggest Japanese film studios roughly 10 years after the end of World War II were, in alphabetical order, Daiei, Nikkatsu, Shin Toho, Shochiku, Toho, and Toei. Those six major studios would usher in what some called the golden era of Japanese cinema back then. Of course, for us, the most relevant question here is, what about movies with horror elements during this golden era? Well, at least according to one of the books I read for my graduation thesis, the two most representative studios with regards to this appear to have been Studio Daiei and Shin Toho. So let's take a closer look at those two. Some of the movies that Studio Daiei produced after the war fell into the category of mystery movies and crime dramas or detective movies. For example, Niji Otoko from 1949, which translates to Rainbow Man, or various detective Akechi Kogoro films. As mentioned in video 2.5, Akechi Kogoro was originally a detective character created by author Edogawa Rampo. Now, even though these weren't always horror movies, they often had a certain creepiness to them. Niji Otoko, for instance, takes their characters to the setting of a strange and fairly isolated mansion. There also were some science fiction films such as Toumei Ningen Arawaru from 1949, which translates to The Invisible Man Appears and was inspired by H.G. Wells' novel The Invisible Man from 1897. But one of the most important works for us that Studio Daiei produced was the critically acclaimed film Ugetsu Monogatari from 1953. It was directed by Mizoguchi Kenji, and it even won the Silver Lion at the Venice Film Festival. Now, some of you may recall that we have talked about a work called Ugetsu Monogatari before. This was in chapter 241, the Edo period kaidan boom, where I briefly mentioned the genre of yomihon that emerged amongst others during the Edo period. As a quick refresher, allow me to just repeat what I explained in that chapter. These yomihon emerged in the mid-18th century and were inspired by a certain genre of novels from China that were written in vernacular Chinese. Yomihon were actually rather challenging works, written for intellectuals, one could say, mixing historical and realistic elements with the supernatural and the uncanny. One of the most important works of this genre is the Ugetsu Monogatari. The title could be translated as Tales of Rain and Moon or Tales Under the Rain-Shrouded Moon. It's from 1776 and was written by Ueda Akinari. This work will be of some importance again in a much later video, but don't worry, I will remind you of this when the time comes. And that time is now, because Mizoguchi Kenji's film from 1953 was based on none other than this Edo period yomihon Ugetsu Monogatari by Ueda Akinari. It should be mentioned, however, that Mizoguchi Kenji's Ugetsu Monogatari film was not a direct one-to-one adaptation of Ueda Akinari's Ugetsu Monogatari yomihon. The original yomihon contained 9 different stories, while the film combined certain plot elements from 2 of its tales, namely the tale Asaji ga Yadu Yado, which translates to the house in the thicket, and the tale Jasei no In, or the serpent's lust. On top of that, some parts of the movie's plot were also based on a short story by French writer Guy de Maupassant called How He Got the Legion of Honor. And while I have seen my fair share of movie adaptations that turned into a painful disaster by completely butchering their original source, here it seems that the deviation from the structure of the original Yomi-On did not actually lessen the overall quality of the final product in any way. In fact, Mizoguchi Kenji's Ugetsu Monogatari from 1953 is widely considered a masterpiece, and among its many praiseworthy elements, there's also the uncanny quality that permeates some of its more eerie scenes, most notably those which center around the character of Lady Wakasa. Let me show you some examples of this. The scene I'm about to play takes place in a mansion to which one of the main characters, a man named Genjuro, who works as a potter, was invited by this Lady Wakasa. While on their way to the mansion, one brief and simple scene shows nothing but a gate moving rather unnaturally by itself, which already adds a certain eerie undertone to the upcoming setting. This is not the scene I actually wanted to show you, by the way, but as simple and short as it may be, I found it quite effective in setting the mood for what follows. And the scene in question with Lady Wakasa comes soon thereafter. Night has fallen and Lady Wakasa is Genjuro brought before her. At first, she merely praises his pottery, but then her romantic feelings for him are revealed. Genjuro seems somewhat taken aback, but soon reciprocates her advances even though he is already married. A short while after that, we see Lady Wakasa singing when suddenly the voice of a man can be heard chanting from an empty samurai armor in the shadows of the room.
Oda Nobunaga no tame ni, nikumu beki Nobunaga no tame ni, horobosaremashita. Ato ni nokorimashita no wa, kono hime-sama to uba no watakushi dake desu. Sentono sama no okokoro wa, ima mo mada kono yashiki ni todomarare, hime-sama ga maaremasu to, kono you ni o utai nasareru no desu.
In my opinion, this scene taps directly into uncanny territory. Such a suit of armor in the dark can already be considered uncanny by itself, as it harkens back to Yench's remark that inanimate objects may appear uncanny if they raise doubts as to whether or not they really are inanimate. And just imagine, for example, wandering down a gloomy hallway of a mansion at night and seeing such a suit of armor in the shadows. I would argue that its humanoid shape can be enough to easily awaken unpleasant thoughts and doubts. But the fact that in this scene a strange voice, something that belongs to the living, is suddenly coming from within this uncanny object makes it even worse. In my opinion, it's also quite a clever move to use this strange and eerie moment to reveal to Genjuro that only the Lady Wakasa and her nursing mother live there now, while her father and everyone else have been killed in a previous attack on the mansion. That means that not only did we just witness an uncanny voice coming from an equally uncanny suit of armor, but at the same time we learn that our current setting is an almost empty mansion and most of its inhabitants have recently been slain. But it gets even worse, because Genjuro eventually meets a Buddhist monk who reveals to him that he seems to be under the spell of a ghost. As it turns out, Lady Wakasa too is already dead, but has returned to this world in search of true love. Genjuro is under her spell, but the monk helps him with a warding spell that he writes directly onto Genjuro's body, and so Genjuro tries to break free, whereas Lady Wakasa wants to take him to her world, only to then notice the warding spell on his body, leading to some eerie and intense moments.
私と一緒に国へ帰りましょう。すぐに。とまされた姫。何やら肌につけている。肌。源十郎様。あなたは肌に。その肌につけたものを取りなさい。お許しください。私を国元へ返してください。いや、返さぬ。仏の祈り。呪い。それを拭いなさい。拭わなければ許しはできぬ。源十郎様。あなたはどうしてこのような恐ろしいことをしてくださいました。いつまでもおそばに置いていただきとうございます。いつまでも。お許しください。
As the cherry on top, when Genjuro awakens the next day, the mansion that he has been in turns out to have been nothing but ruins since long, from which now, similar to the suit of armor scene, a singing voice can be heard. Alright, next let us take a look at the studio Shin-Toho. Studio Shin-Toho had been struggling financially after World War II for some time, and while it would eventually declare bankruptcy in 1961, it was earlier in 1955 that Okura Mitsugu took over as the new company president and managed to rein in some great successes for several years, while focusing heavily on the horror genre. There was, for instance, Onryo Sakura Dai Sodo from 1956, a rough translation would be The Vengeful Ghost of Sakura, or once again a Yotsuya Kaidan adaptation also from 1956, which was again simply called Yotsuya Kaidan. This Yotsuya Kaidan adaptation was shown that year during the Obon Festival, together with an older film called Nabeshima Kaibyoden from 1949, the title of which can be translated as The Ghost Cat of Nabeshima. And this double feature was so successful that, just like before World War II, it became customary once more to show ghost movies every summer, a trend that was then also followed by other studios. Number-wise, if you count all ghost movies that came out during the mid to late 50s, then Shin-Toho is actually the studio that released the largest amount of them. Their movies were inspired not only by Japanese works, but also by Chinese as well as Western cinema. However, probably the most successful and noteworthy work that was produced at Studio Shin-Toho was yet another film adaptation of Yotsuya Kaidan, and it is perhaps the most famous of them all, the 1959 version, carrying the same name as Namboku's theater play from 1825, Tokaido Yotsuya Kaidan, directed by Nakagawa Nobuo. The film is known in English under the name The Ghost of Yotsuya. And while the movie differs from the original play in some points, it still feels like a pretty faithful adaptation of its source material and does a great job at depicting a terrifying Oiwa whose vengeful spirit relentlessly pursues Iemon. Allow me to show you a few examples from the movie. Let's start with this one. Yeah, that's pretty terrifying. It also includes some of the play's most famous scenes, such as the comb scene, or the scene where Ieamon finds the door in a river to which Oiwa and another character had been nailed. We talked about this scene in chapter 242 when the original play was discussed, but here's a quick reminder. In the original play, Ieamon orders his lackeys to nail his former servant Kohei to one side of a door and Oiwa's body to the other side, and then he orders them to throw the whole door into a river. Later, there's a scene where Ieamon is at a river when this very door drifts down in front of him. He approaches the door and pulls it towards the bank of the river when suddenly both Kohei's and Oiwa's corpse come to life. In the movie from 1959, there is a different male character nailed to the door, though here it's a masseur called Takuetsu instead of Ieamon's former servant Kohei. Here is the version of this film. 'As you can see at the end, Ieamon is not doing so well anymore, and that is no surprise, because Oiwa keeps tormenting him again and again. But maybe I shouldn't even show you too much of this already. Instead, I can only recommend you give the film a try yourself if you can. Now then, to sum up, overall, you can see that, as far as Japanese horror cinema is concerned, many directors in the early days turned to popular kaidan or would at least incorporate typical ghost story plots. And even after World War II, this trend continued in what some back then called the golden era of Japanese cinema. At the same time, there was also a rising number of mystery and science fiction films, and Western influence in Japanese cinema was growing steadily as well. Oh, and in case you were wondering what the other large film studios were doing around this time, well, it's not like I had the time to watch every movie of each of these 6 major studios, so what follows are somewhat generalized statements, but Studio Nikkatsu focused a lot on youth-oriented movies and film noir. Studio Shochiku was best known for romantic and melodramatic movies, often aimed at female audiences. Studio Toei actually made some ghost movies too, and at Studio Toho, a lot of famous director Akira Kurosawa's movies were directed. Furthermore, Studio Toho would soon become the leading studio with regards to a certain new genre, which we will discuss in the next part. I hope to see you then. And as always, take care and goodbye.